It's always pretty interesting when a crossover game has original characters made for it. Ai and Yuki in Neo Geo Battle Coliseum, Reiji and Xiaomu in Namco Cross Capcom and Project Cross Zone, and maybe the most famous example, Sora in Kingdom Hearts. You wouldn't think a series like Marvel vs. Capcom would need something like this, but the series has a few. There's Norimaro, Amingo, and even though she's a legacy character of sorts, Sansan. But I think most people agree that the coolest one by a significant margin is the character designed to be Marvel vs. Capcom 2's lead protagonist, Ruby Heart. In the absolutely paper-thin plot of Marvel 2, a mysterious dark energy wreaks havoc across the world, killing sea and plant life of all kind and eventually threatens to consume the Earth. Ruby Heart, a pirate that travels the globe on her airship, discovers this, and corrals the Marvel and Capcom characters into banding together and figuring out the source of this impending calamity. Ruby Heart's creation has actually been a source of contention and various rumors over the years. The most notable long-standing one is that she was initially designed for a Vampire Savior sequel that never came to pass, and the design was used for Marvel 2 instead, relayed by both former Capcom community manager Seth Killian and former Street Fighter series head Yoshinori Ono on 2 separate occasions. And taken at face value, that doesn't sound wrong. While Darkstalkers is known for its fantastical characters, a pirate wouldn't seem too out of the ordinary for the human side of the Darkstalkers cast. However, this stands at odds with an interview with the development team itself from around the game's initial release, where it's revealed that Ruby's design was commissioned specifically for Marvel 2. Essentially, the idea was to design a female lead that could be used as a marquee character, presumably opposite of Cable, who served that role on the Marvel side. This is more or less supported in-game too. She's the Capcom character that gets top billing in the game's intro, and while Marvel 2 itself just has one generic ending for every character, the ending sequence taking place on her ship and the penultimate scene showing her discarding Abyss's orb into the ocean kind of makes her the de facto lead of the game. Wherever the truth lies, Ruby has a fantastic design that slots in well with the Capcom cast. It's kind of a shame that she really hasn't been used at all outside of this game, but apparently that wasn't for lack of trying. At one point during the mid-2010s, Capcom announced a mobile social game in Japan, which was the style at the time, Dai Kokai Frontier. Very little media was ever released for this game outside of its website, but the most notable thing about it was that it was pirate-themed, and one of the main characters was Ruby Heart herself. However, the game was never spoken of again, and the game's website was quietly deleted, more than likely signaling its cancellation. On the Shadaloo CRI website that came out alongside Street Fighter V, delving into different corners of the Street Fighter shared universe, canon or otherwise, a character looking suspiciously like Ruby Heart, even sharing the same first name, appeared on the website. Before you get too excited though, it's since been clarified that though she's obviously based on Ruby Heart, she's not meant to be the one from Marvel 2, but instead connected to another Capcom game, Pirate Ship Higemaru. Specifically, she's the sister of the game's protagonist, Momotaro, who, according to Street Fighter V and 6 director Takayuki Nakayama, has fought Ryu at some point in the past and is thus a part of the Street Fighter universe. He was actually intended to get in Street Fighter V very early on, but his character spot ended up going to Birdie instead. She has popped up in the second SNK vs. Capcom Card Fighters game in the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and it's not as good sequel on the DS, so that's something I guess. And that's a real shame, because Ruby Heart's cool as all hell. As a pirate, she travels around the world searching for valuable artifacts on her airship, and some of these artifacts, as well as the ship itself, is actually represented in her moveset. Clearly, a lot of thought was put into her overall design. Ruby's voiced in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 by Itsuko Tanaka, who I've also mentioned in the previous video as one of the go-to Japanese voice actors for badass women. She's the Japanese voice of Bayonetta, Trish in Devil May Cry 4, 5, and Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Chun-Li in Third Strike and Capcom Fighting Evolution, Poison in pretty much all of her Street Fighter appearances, and those are just some of the fighting and action games. Just because Ruby's a Marvel 2 original character doesn't mean there isn't a good deal to talk about here, especially since Ruby has one of the more interesting movesets. Let's get into it. Ruby Heart is a trap-oriented character in Marvel 2. She can put a lot of stuff out on the screen to trip the opponent up, drain their meter, and straight up immobilize them in certain scenarios. She has pretty decent buttons overall, though she notably lacks command normals of any sort, and a lot of that screen control means little to characters with superior mobility options like Sentinel or Storm. Still though, Ruby's a generally solid character that provides some decent team synergy on point and as an assist. Small detail here, but Ruby's also one of the only characters to have a unique animation for Marvel 2's Universal Launcher, separate from her crouching heavy punch and standing heavy kick launchers. Ruby's first special move is an advancing charge, done with the quarter circle forward and punch. Ruby will dash forward cloaked in energy, hitting multiple times. If you press punch up to 2 times combined with the direction, she can follow up with additional attacks. The move itself is very similar to John Talbane's Beast Cannon move in the Darkstalkers games, right down to being able to do a follow-up attack by pressing punch in any direction. The standard version travels forward on the ground, while the heavy version initially goes upwards at a 45-degree angle. This is pretty much her best mobility option, so it's good to use if you want to create some space between yourself and the opponent. It also has a very slightly faster recovery if aimed directly into the ground. This move also gets a little weird when done in specific circumstances. More on that later. Fantôme is done with a quarter circle back and kick. Ruby puts down a chest that spawns a ghost. Light kick has the ghost travel forwards, while heavy kick has it go slightly upwards. If the ghost hits the opponent, they'll latch onto them and drain them of their super meter. The heavy kick variation drains slightly more meter. If Ruby's hit while putting the chest down, the ghost won't spawn, but if the ghost is out and she gets hit, the ghost stays. It can be destroyed by projectiles though. There's some funny stuff that can be done with this move that can make things even more annoying for your opponent, but again, we'll save that for later. Fantôme is a French word that translates into spirit or ghost, making it a pretty fitting name for this move. Sublimation is done with a quarter circle forward and kick. She whips out a presumably magic book and summons a wall of water that pops up pretty high into the air. This is a fantastic lockdown tool that also happens to leave her plus on block and is a cornerstone of her screen control abilities. Light kick has the water spawn close to her, while heavy kick spaces it a little further out, but not quite full screen. Rafale Cannon is done with a half circle back and punch. This attack's properties change depending on which punch strength is used. The light version is a hit grab that can be comboed into, and the heavy version goes upwards at the 45-degree angle and puts the opponent into a brief capture state. Rafale is the French term for a burst of wind, so this was probably named with the light punch variation of the attack in mind, which would produce that from the explosion that launches the opponent. Ruby Heart's first hyper combo is done with a quarter circle forward and 2 punches. This is a powered up version of her first special move, and can similarly be extended with additional follow-up hits. Like the regular variation, aiming it into the ground makes Ruby recover a lot faster than normal. Her second hyper combo is Partenaire, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks. The initial hit of this is similar to Jin's Bloodia punch in that it travels across the screen to hit the opponent. Unlike Bloodia though, if it connects, Ruby's ship will begin shooting the opponent multiple times. Also like Bloodia punch, the visuals for this attack are kinda broken in the HD ports of the game when played in widescreen. Partenaire is the name of Ruby Heart's ship and is the French word for partner. Fitting. Her third hyper combo is Mille Fantôme, done with a quarter circle back and 2 kicks. This is a powered up version of Fantôme, summoning even more ghosts at once, and they deal damage instead of stealing meter. This hyper combo has great utility when used in DHCs, as once Ruby puts the chest down, the ghost will still come out after another character DHCs in, giving them an extremely safe way in. The move name translates to 1000 ghosts, which, yeah, that checks out. Her fourth and most interesting hyper combo is Tour de Magie, done by pressing heavy kick, light punch, down, light kick, and heavy punch. Ruby summons a barrel from the sky, and if it isn't blocked, begins a mini-game of sorts. Ruby can use either light punch or light kick to throw a knife into one of two openings on the barrel. She has a 50-50 chance of hitting the right one, and each correct guess does more damage than the last. If she guesses wrong, the barrel explodes and the super ends prematurely. The correct sequence to get maximum damage on this super is 100% RNG, meaning this isn't exactly the most reliable of hyper combos. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have its uses. If an enemy is in the air and hit by the barrel during Ruby's initial summoning animation, they'll be sent into a spinning knockdown state that can be comboed off of with an OTG. What's particularly notable about this is that while it combos, the combo scaling gets reset when the barrel hits the opponent, meaning Ruby gets a free combo with the damage scaling reset. Toridimaji translates to magic trick, which is self-explanatory. The super itself is based off of the children's toy, Pop-Up Pirate. Ruby Heart's first assist is Sublimation. Her second assist is the heavy version of Rafale Cannon. Ruby's third assist is a unique assist-only move. She pulls out a crimson orb with a flame in it. If your controlled character touches the orb, they get a brief power boost for a few seconds. At first glance, this looks like a generic orb, but it bears an uncanny resemblance to one of the mystic orbs that can be used in Red Earth. Maybe it's one of the many treasures she's obtained in her travels. So, I mentioned that some weird things can happen with some of Ruby's moves in this game, depending on the circumstances. How weird are we talking? Well... Look, we all know Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is a game that's held together with duct tape, chewing gum, and a dream. At this point, that's part of its charm. But some of the glitches associated with her can take this to an entirely new, messed up level. For example, using the heavy version of Phantom and then immediately using the Assist 2 snapback will summon the ghost as usual, but instead of moving forwards, the ghost will slowly move vertically downwards, eventually going off screen. At first, all it looks like it does is lock Ruby out of using it again, since the ghost is still technically somewhere on screen, but this one has an effect that's more immediately noticeable to the opponent. Because the ghost is still considered technically active and on screen, if your opponent is anywhere near it and they try to move backwards, they'll trigger the game's proximity guard instead, limiting their movement and very specifically locking them out of the ability to perform backdashes. This works in the arcade and Dreamcast versions of the game as well as the HD ports, but to an extent. The issue there is that the ghost doesn't completely go off screen downwards in this version, instead lingering near the bottom. At least when played in widescreen anyway, so you have to actively protect the ghost from being destroyed when you first summon it. With this glitch, you can do some functionally useless but hilarious stuff. Speaking of the HD versions, there's been some reported instances of Ruby in particular inexplicably transforming into other characters when tagged in before inevitably soft-locking the game. A notable example being this video that showcases her becoming Iceman for some reason. But the glitch she's best known for is also arguably the most destructive glitch in the entire game. If you hold the taunt button, then do her quarter circle forward and punch special, some pretty messed up things start happening depending on what directions you hold and what buttons you mash. Sometimes, she'll turn into a barrel and then fly off the screen Gambit glitch style, though unlike Gambit, Ruby almost always comes back down. Eventually. In the arcade version, sometimes this glitch would actually give the player performing it free credits, much to the chagrin of arcade operators. But perhaps the most disruptive is the other possibility, where she can straight up freeze, reset, or even outright crash the game. On consoles, this is but a recoverable annoyance. In the arcades though, this straight up makes the cabinet unusable if it freezes, requiring the arcade operator to open it up and manually reset the board. Growing up, there was a guy in my local laundromat who would do this constantly to get one over on people that usually beat him in this game, and the guy responsible for the cabinets there got so fed up with his antics that he outright removed the machine and replaced it with a crane game instead. Doing the Gambit glitch is one thing, but that doesn't fuck it up for everyone like this glitch does. It was removed from the PS2 port of the game, though over the years I've heard that it was possible in the original Xbox version. I don't have any way to verify that though. As far as the HD versions go, it doesn't work in the PS3 version supposedly, but apparently does work in the Xbox 360 version under certain circumstances. Ruby in general can cause some really odd bugs depending on how she interacts with things like Thanos bubbles. It's weird but honestly kind of fascinating. Also, if you set out a ghost, tag out, and use her power-up orb assist, the ghost turns red for some reason. Not a big glitch or anything, but I think it's funny. Most of the stages in Marvel 2 are generic locations, but the 3 original characters all have one stage that can be uniquely associated with them, and Ruby Heart's stage takes place on the Partenaire, her airship. The default version of this stage begins during a storm, with several other airships that can be seen traveling overhead. As the match goes on, the skies get less stormy as the ship starts sailing through clearer weather. On the sides of the ship are some cannons, which makes sense to have on a ship of this size. In the middle of the stage seems to be some kind of control console. There's a screen with what looks to be some kind of reticule on it. Maybe it's for navigation. There's also more than a few danger signs around it as well, so maybe the ship's power source is located here as well. There's a door behind the ship leading to what I imagine are the lower cabins. Right above that door at the ship's stern seems to be the ship wheel. Everything on the ship seems relatively automated, but it's probably necessary to be able to steer manually regardless. Kind of like an airplane, I guess. The alternate version of the stage that can be unlocked in the console versions takes place on a clear, moonlit night. Most of the stage assets are bathed in blue-hued moonlight, but are otherwise unaltered. I love the vibe of this stage variation though. It's one of my personal favorite stages in the game. Since we're talking about stages, we may as well talk about the stage music too. The stage theme is one of the more laid-back tracks in the game. The bridge of the song has some vocal samples of Ameo speaking, but I've never been able to parse much of what he's saying beyond "Can you feel it?" and "I know you can." I wonder if they're taken from an obscure 90s sample library like a lot of fighting game composers seemed to do back then. Also, the bass line for this track is incredible. Listen out for it the next time you give the song a play. Now is probably a good time to talk about this theme's composer, Tetsuya Shibata. Shibata is a former Capcom composer, now freelance as far as I know, that started off composing the new tracks in Vampire Savior 2 as well as Vampire Hunter 2. He'd go on to work with fellow Darkstalkers composer Takayuki Iwai on the Plasma Sword soundtrack. He was one of many composers that contributed to Street Fighter Alpha 3, having done Dan, Akuma, and Kami's themes in that game, before composing the soundtrack for the first Power Stone game. As far as Marvel 2 goes, Shibata specifically composed the Clock Tower, Airship, Desert, and Cave themes, along with the Abyss themes, and the credits theme I tend to use at the end of these character videos. He'd go on to do the soundtrack for Automodelista and contributed to a few other Capcom soundtracks like Monster Hunter 1, Resident Evil Outbreak, and Devil May Cry 2 and 3, very specifically being the person that composed The Devil's Never Cry, the main theme of Devil May Cry 3. He'd go freelance afterwards, having worked on many soundtracks across the industry, contributing to games like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Transformers Devastation, and Final Fantasy XV, though he'd also work with Capcom again for games like Monster Hunter Tri and most recently Resident Evil 4 Remake. He's married to another former Capcom composer, Yoshino Aoki, who was one of the lead composers of Breath of Fire 3 and the main composer of Breath of Fire 4, among other games. And she also provided the vocals for a certain Capcom theme that's made an appearance in the Versus games a few times. We'll roll ahead and talk about her and that specific song in a future video. Here are Ruby Heart's colors. In a game featuring iconic comic book and video game characters like Spider-Man, Mega Man, and Wolverine among others, you'd think an original character wouldn't stand a chance to be noticed, but that's thankfully not the case with Ruby Heart. She's an incredibly strong design, has an interesting moveset, and even ties Marvel 2's admittedly small plot together. That said, she really doesn't get used all too often these days. Outside of the aforementioned cancelled mobile game and the Card Fighters games, she was notably an alternate costume for Rose in Street Fighter V's final season. Using the costume also replaced Rose's scarf with Ruby Heart's anchor, which is a pretty nice touch. Ruby was also one of the characters present on the Days of Future Past poster in Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 as well. Street Fighter 6 producer Shuhei Matsumoto has recently acknowledged the distinct possibility of Marvel 2's original characters coming to Street Fighter one day, especially considering the Marvel vs. Capcom collection will probably put those characters in people's minds again, but we'll see what happens. All that said, that's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.